do want to. I have one last quote that is almost as good as the one about the country dance. It's from General Greene, who writes, "To behold our fellows chasing the Hessians off the field of battle afforded a pleasure which you can better conceive than I describe." You know, really good stuff. Really good stuff. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it.
Go team. Go team.
Yeah, that's right. So now both sides claim victory at the battle. Casualties are comparable: 260 for the British, 11% of forces engaged. 211 for the Americans, 7.8% of forces engaged. Remember, of those 260 British casualties, 27% of those occurred at the ambush down on the East Road. So that was, quite a bloody affair in relation to the total losses. In the parlance of the 18th century, if you remain masters of the battlefield, you've won, right? Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse. He was on the battlefield. That means he won. But what a Pyrrhic victory that was, right? Because they got so bloodied that they couldn't maintain their campaign any longer and had to march to the sea to get resupplied, and ultimately ended up in Virginia at Yorktown. But Sullivan's objective was to get off the island, which he did that night, and thus the British were left masters of the field. They could claim a technical victory. They could claim victory because they still possessed Newport. Sullivan claimed victory because his objective was to get his army off the island intact, which he did. And they could claim victory because the American forces stood toe-to-toe with the best that Europe could throw at them, and held their own. You know, the Hessians were considered, arguably even better quality troops than the British. So that was quite an accomplishment for the Americans to boast. Strategically, the British hold on to Newport until October 1779, meaning that they can still base their navy here and still interdict shipping and all that. So strategically, not so much a draw, I think more on the British side. And given that it was the very first attempt by our French allies to cooperate, and it ended as it did, that's not such a good story either.
It made Sullivan so happy, though.
Yeah, Sullivan, and I didn't mention this under the tent because I felt like I wanted to give you guys that hour to walk around with the local folks, but thanks for saying that, because the Americans were outraged. In fact, I said that was my last quote. I'm going to give you one more. And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to quote directly, and the language is, it's...
Is that possible in the 18th century?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Sullivan wrote a document entitled "Protest of the General Officers on Rhode Island," and it was against the behavior of the French. And not only he, but some of the other American officers participated, and Sullivan basically endorsed everything that was written that was critical of the French. And they used these, you'll forgive the off-color language, I hope, they used these terms. It was rascally.
Oh, man. Mark, come on.
It was inexplicable. And it was outright desertion. So, it was rascally. It doesn't get any worse than that in the 18th century.
It kept Lafayette very busy, though.
I set you right up for that one, didn't I? That was good. But no, it was so acrimonious that you had American officers. Now remember, Lafayette is part of the mess, the officers' mess. He's a major general. He's already proven himself at the Battle of Brandywine, and he's commanding 2,500 troops, some Continental, some state troops, and some militia, mixed force. So he had stature here, and you know, he's sitting in the wardroom, and you've got all these American officers, you know, complaining, you know, about what the French have just done. They're not coming back. And a rumor started to circulate that there was going to be a duel fought between the commanding officer, Major General John Sullivan, and Lafayette. Congress got wind of it and ordered General Washington to personally intercede, which he did. He was always, except for when he fired Charles Lee in the saddle at Monmouth, except for that one episode, Washington, you could pretty much count on being even-tempered and very diplomatic. And he wrote 4 letters, one to Sullivan, one to Greene, one to Lafayette, and one to D'Estaing. And in those letters, you know, he argued for calm, and he argued for keeping your eye on the prize. You know, we're in this together. The objective is to beat the British, blah, 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 the cause of liberty, and so on. And in the end, cooler heads prevailed. But frankly, one can say Rhode Island is also significant because it came within a gnat's breadth of upending the brand new Franco-American alliance before it ever got any traction.
That's something I always say when someone says, "Oh, it's an example of the first, the first cooperation with the French alliance." I said, "Yeah, and it almost ended it."
It almost ended it, you know. So the French do sail away eventually to the Caribbean. They come back. They help at the Battle of Savannah, which I think is, if you'll forgive a shameless plug, I believe that's Volume 4 in the BOA series. They cooperate there too, and once again there's friction with the American High Command, and it doesn't really end well there either, although not as ingloriously as here. So that's, you know, that's the story. It's a great story to tell. It needs to be told. It deserves way more than a footnote, particularly when you focus on, you know, the could have beens or the should have beens, depending on your point of view.
The want of the nail.
Yeah, the want of a nail. So what a blessing that we had clearing conditions. We didn't even know if the tour would make, frankly. Last night's radar or forecast was predicting 80 and 90% thunderstorms through the middle of the day. So it all works
you
out
can't
for
believe
us.
the forecasters.
And,
I want a job where I get paid that much to be wrong as much as they are.
Yeah.
And Mark, was there any post-war exchange between the generals, the French and Sullivan, arguing about what happened here?
Yeah, I mean, post-war
I
writings.
can't cite you. I can't cite you any of the apology communications. There were some, but
On whose side was the apology?
eventually, mostly from the Americans. I mean, Washington, you know, leveraged Sullivan to take back some of what was said, and that was done. You know, in veiled apology, you know, like politicians do today. Veiled apology.
And Lafayette did a lot of work
sorry
to
you
ameliorate
caught
this
me in a
on
lie.
on the French side. So.
Type thing.
Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made.
I didn't make them, but somebody made them.
Mistakes were made, right? And you know, I want to. You bring up one other interesting point there, Larry. Think about it for a second. Think back to what we were saying under the tent. The Americans came ashore a day ahead of schedule on the 9th. So, okay, the French came ashore. And the plan was to attack on the 10th. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 9th. Sails are sighted coming over the horizon. It's Howe's relief force. I mean, the circumstances that caused those ships to arrive when they did in that moment, which led D'Estaing to then make his decision to re-embark his men in sortie, may not have happened the way they did. For one thing, it took the French from April to July to get here from France. Why? Because first, to deceive the British as to their destination, they sailed to the Mediterranean as a ruse, then doubled back, then started crossing the Atlantic, then slowed down the crossing in order to chase prize ships. Oh, there's a merchantman, let's go get it, you know, that type thing.
Ooh, shiny.
Then they showed up in the Delaware Bay first, but because they knew the British had been in Philadelphia, only to discover that Clinton's army had already marched to New York, the Battle of Monmouth, and Volume 5 in BOA. Sorry. Then he sailed from Delaware Bay to New York. Then he consulted with Washington. Then he agreed to cooperate here at Newport. It took 6 days to get here from New York, where it normally takes 3. I'm not sure why. Contrary winds, I don't know. Tides, who knows? So all those delays on the part of the French. Meanwhile, what about the Americans? It's a story from start to finish of tardiness. You know, the state legislatures are tardy in voting the levy. Then it's tardy pulling the levy together. Then the levy shows up, but they don't have equipment. So now you got to find the equipment. Then you got to get the boats. Then you got to. So there were delays. There were delays on the part of the Americans. There were delays on the part of the French. If at any point, almost at any point, if someone had showed just that much more urgency about what they were doing, then this action at Newport would have happened prior to when it did, which means it would have gone in before the British arrived. And even as it, and before the storm, but even as it is, they came within hours, just hours, of launching the attack. From 1 o'clock on the 9th of August, when the sails were sighted, to what, the next morning, when the attack would have gone in. And so, you know, we model that for you in the Newport side of the game. We have all the forces arrayed, where they were. You can see what may have happened. It's an interesting what-if scenario. And it's just remarkable to me that it came so close to actually happening. So for all those reasons, this is a story worth telling. And you know, McBurney's written a good, accessible book, and there's some other books which I recommend McBurney's book to you. But you know, hopefully with the 250th anniversary coming up and the work of the committee now to restore the fort and turning it into a legitimate park, maybe, and with your help as individuals telling your friends and neighbors, maybe gradually, slowly, the story that deserves to be told will get to it. So, any other questions, sir?
On the potential battle, have you gotten any insight from people as to what the average or typical result is?
It hasn't been played enough in competition yet. I'll tell you that Dave Stifler, and I'm pointing right at his camera over there, Dave Stifler and I met at the WBC in the final last year, 2022. And the final was the Newport campaign game. And we played the full 2 days. And when his Americans failed to win on day 1, I was so certain that he didn't have a chance.
So was I.
His personal morale was in the tank, you know, because the best hope
when a
for
beer
the
helps.
American player in the full campaign is to breach the outer line by taking any 3 of the 5 readouts. And typically what you'll see is it's easy to take 2. Pick 2, you can generally take 2. It's the third one that's the razor's edge, and the game will come down to the last turn or 2, battling over whichever third readout you're playing for. And he didn't take it. He close, but he didn't. And I said, great, now he's got to come all the way to me, to the inner line. I can fall back upon my shorten my front and fall back and stuff, and he beat me anyway. He did the rascally rabbit, he beat me anyway. So we haven't had enough playings yet in competitive play, and I keep all the records from tournaments. We played the Rhode Island scenario, the title game, at WBC this year, and it was there were 8 pairs playing. There were 3 British wins, 3 American wins, and 2 draws. So that's pretty good play balance, and I think you will find when you play that one that's very well balanced. But the full campaign is a little, we don't know yet. Any other questions?
During the battle, was there any British or Hessian artillery on this hill?
Yes.
Because there is still the remains on one of these slopes of a artillery flechette.
Yes.
Can't tell you where to find it. I saw it last probably about 15 years ago. But
The British put their guns on Quaker Hill, the Hessians put their guns on Turkey Hill, and across this 1 mile to Butts Hill there was this bombardment, but again, very little effect.
yeah, the person who had showed it me called it a Hessian flèche, and I'd never looked into it to find out exactly where artillery was in place
Yeah,
and such.
yeah. And the map doesn't have it as a fixed position, but you bring your artillery forward as a player, and you just put it on the slope, and blast away. Any other questions?
You had, 211 British casualties total?
260.
260, so they're higher than. Okay, so quarter of that was the campus that knocked it down to 200 or so, with 2 assaults. And so even if you divide it, you got 800 to 1,500, 800 to 1,200 men in each assault. So you got about 50 casualties. The last assault probably was the heaviest casualty.
Right.
So figure about half the casualties per there. So I make out, just doing the math, the Hessians suffered about 50 casualties in order to stop them.
And
There's a lot more than just casualties.
Sure,
So,
of course, but the larger, I think a larger point is that the American Revolution, with the exception only of as many battles as you can name on one hand, with the exception of those few battles, Bunker Hill is one, Savannah is one, that comes to mind. With the exception of those, you're talking about a non-sanguine conflict. You're talking about battles and engagements with few casualties, relatively speaking, and it's about breaking the will of the enemy army to stand. And the game within the game in my system is the Army morale track, which tracks the erosion or the acceleration of will, and your capabilities degrade as your will, as your morale, Army morale reduces. You become fatigued, then you become wavering, and you can lose the game by becoming demoralized, even without taking the stipulated objectives or whatever. And that's just through retreats, disruptions, leader loss, things
So
like
sort of
that.
the question I got is more a historical question, simulation. So, it seems like a very low casualty rate, 7 or 8%. And there's a lot of smoke on the battlefield, men are falling, men are hanging back. And it only takes 4 guys to suddenly break and make 800 guys off to the side of the run. So I was just curious, like that low casualty rate.
And consider too that those like the brown vest that he had demonstrated there, that the typical weapon on both sides, the Charleroi brown vest. Maximum effective range 80, more typically 50.
From here to try and hit a guy down there?
Yep,
Try.
pretty much.
Try.
Yeah.
And that's why volley fire and massed fire was the ticket, because you didn't have to aim, you just point and hope that some knuckleball, musket ball that's doing this is going to hit something.
Well, I always described it as reason for the linear attack is that you took one inaccurate weapon and turned it into a giant shotgun.
Oh, absolutely. So I call it an unnamed fire
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
But what I bring up is that, okay, so clearly it's an issue of morale. Casualties aren't huge. And one of the things that I always, when I love standing on the ground view, is I love to feel the direction of the wind. And I imagine what that's going to do to the smoke.
The smoke.
On one side or the other.
Yeah, yeah.
And as far as morale, where if you can't see, and
And
guys are falling.
it only took a volley or two to obscure. When you're that close and each side fires a volley or two, now you can't see
Well,
anything.
especially in August with the humidity the way it is now, and that black powder smoke just hangs on the ground in high humidity.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was curious about, just as a historical, what
Yeah.
the historical.
I mean, I'm a reenactor, and I can
Okay.
show you a picture because I'm
Yeah.
behind a line
Yeah.
of militiamen, and they're firing at the redcoats,
Yeah.
and you'll see how you can barely see the redcoats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a
well,
great shot like
and
that
how
from Saratoga
impacts
to
on the
Fifth.
morale of the battle decision making.
Yeah, and there's a great movie, not about the American Revolution, but to your point about morale. I want to say it's called Kalani,
Oh yes.
and it was done in black and white,
old
intentionally
movie, yeah.
grainy. Even though it's a modern film, I mean, maybe in the 80s or 90s it was made. but it was filmed black and white, grainy, as if it were a documentary, as if there were a reporter embedded with the troops at the Battle of Culloden. Well, at one point in that film, the reporter is with the British regiment, and they're in line, okay, and there's smoke and fog on the moor, and all you can hear is the screaming of the charging Highlanders. You can't see them. They're screaming, and it's getting louder, and the earth is starting to tremble under all the footfalls and stuff. And they emerge. I mean, from here to that little tree right here, they emerge and they're on you,
Yeah, with
like
this
wild
giant-
men. Yeah, and so, you know, a picture that here with all the smoke and you know, so you're a shopkeeper
Here you go.
from Bristol and you've been
Sir?
dragooned into service, and
Let me get a picture of that.
you're gonna want to go.
I was going to say, I've actually done some research on mobs. Particularly trying to get a video of mobs breaking. And one thing I've seen is a mob breaks so fast that even in a 30th frame, you can't figure out what precipitated. I have not been able to on these two different occasions. So I'm thinking it just takes a couple guys breaking the line.
Some voice in the rear. Retreat!
Or move. Back
Yeah.
on the bicentennial, we were doing the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and I was down there, and I was with the Continental Line, and we started out playing the position part of militia because we didn't have enough, and then we fell back and reformed and became instantly Continental Line. But where we were at the front of the American formation, and there was this little rise and a dip, and then a line of woods. So the British troops are marching toward us, and you could see the colors first, and then you saw the bearskins. And then they came just over the hill, and the entire British line went to charge bayonets. And I knew I was perfectly safe, but in the pit of my stomach, my stomach is going, leave and leave now.
Well, and that was the thing. If you were militia, it was British tactical doctrine to close the 75 yards and charge with the bayonet. Hard to
Any
stand
other-
against that.
We're
Any
mulligan
other
confidence except for
questions?
when it did
Anybody
work.
further back in the group here?
James.
I guess we're done, kids. We can.
Thank you very much.
We can make our way back.